He had $14, a horse with a bad knee, and the nerve to walk up to the most powerful man in the county and ask for his daughter's hand. Silas Ashcroft didn't laugh. He didn't throw Elias off the porch. He did something far worse. He smiled. "Boy," the old rancher said, setting down his coffee like he had all the time in the world, "you want to court my daughter? Fine. I've got a job for you. 6 months. No wages, no promises. And when it's done," he picked up his cup again, "I'll think about it." That smile never reached his eyes. Before we ride into this story together, if you've ever worked for something with no guarantee it would pay off, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the end. You won't regret it. The morning Elias Boone decided to ruin his life, the sky over the Bitterroot Valley was the color of a fresh bruise. He'd been awake since 3, lying on his bunk in the bunkhouse, listening to Pete Calloway snore and the wind scrape dead leaves against the window. He told himself he wasn't going to do it. He'd been telling himself that for 6 weeks. But somewhere around 4 in the morning, with the darkness pressing down and his heart doing what it had been doing every time he thought about Lydia Ashcroft, he sat up, pulled on his boots, and made a decision that a smarter man probably wouldn't have made. He was going to talk to her father. The Ashcroft Ranch sat about 2 miles east of the Broken Spur, where Elias had worked the past 8 months. The Broken Spur was a decent enough outfit. 100 head of cattle, a respectable spread, a fair boss named Harlan who paid on time and didn't work a man into the ground for sport. It wasn't the Ashcroft operation, though. Nobody's spread was the Ashcroft operation. Silas Ashcroft had come to Montana Territory in 1861 with $40, a pregnant wife, and a stubbornness that apparently ran bone deep in that family. By 1882, the man owned close to 12,000 acres, ran over 1,000 head of cattle, employed 14 full-time hands, and sat on the Territorial Land Council. He was not a man who needed anything from anyone, and he made sure every person within 50 miles understood that, without ever saying it outright. Elias had met him exactly twice. Once at a cattle auction in Millhaven, where Silas had outbid every man in the room on a prize bull without blinking. Once at a church social, where Silas had shaken Elias's hand with the same enthusiasm a man shakes a doorknob and moved on without asking his name. The second meeting was also the first time Elias had seen Lydia up close. He wasn't going to think about that right now. He was going to think about what he was going to say. He saddled Duchess in the gray pre-dawn, talking to her in the low murmur she liked. Duchess was 12 years old, a red roan mare with a bum left knee that had been bummed since Elias bought her off a stock trader in Wyoming 4 years ago for $30, which had been every dollar he owned at the time. The knee swelled in cold weather, and she favored it on bad days. She was not a handsome horse, but she was steady, and steadiness counted for more than pretty in Elias Boone's experience. "We're going to do something stupid today," he told her, tightening the cinch. "But we're going to do it with our head up." Duchess flicked an ear back at him. She did not appear impressed. The ride to the Ashcroft Ranch took him past the north edge of Millhaven, where the town was just starting to stir. A light in the bakery window, smoke rising from the blacksmith's chimney, a dog barking at something in an alley. Elias tipped his hat at old Hector Vasquez, who was sweeping his store porch in the thin morning light, and pretended not to notice. He needed to think. The trouble with what he was doing, besides the obvious trouble, besides the near-certain humiliation waiting for him at the end of a 2-mile ride, was that he wasn't sure he could explain it properly even to himself. He wasn't the kind of man who fell into things easily. He didn't make fast friends. He didn't trust quick. He kept his feelings more or less to himself, which most people took for coldness, but was really just caution. The kind of caution that gets bred into a boy who grows up watching his father make one bad bet after another until there's nothing left to bet. But Lydia Ashcroft had gotten past his caution without really trying. He'd seen her first at the church social. Not seen her exactly, more like registered her the way you register a sudden change in the weather. She'd been arguing with her brother Thomas about something, gesturing with a piece of pie in her hand, completely unbothered by the fact that they were in public. When Thomas said something she didn't like, she pointed the fork at him with the kind of directness that most women in 1882 Montana had been trained out of by the time they were 12. "You are wrong about that, Thomas, and if you say it again, I'm going to eat your piece too." Thomas had laughed. Elias had stood 6 feet away and felt something shift. It wasn't that she was beautiful, though she was. It wasn't anything he could pin down to a single feature or moment. It was more like she seemed to take up the exact right amount of space. Not too much, not too little. Like she'd figured something out that most people were still working on. In the 8 months since, he'd been near her exactly 7 times. He'd counted. 4 of those times they'd spoken actual words to each other. Twice at the general store, once at another community gathering, once by accident when her horse had shied at something in the road and he'd caught the bridle without thinking. That last time she'd looked at him with an expression he'd spent the past month trying to decipher. Not gratitude exactly. Something more like assessment. 7 encounters. Not enough to know a person. Enough to know he wanted to. The Ashcroft Ranch came into view just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. A proper setup, solid construction, the kind of place built to last rather than just built. The main house was 2 stories of timber and stone, with a wraparound porch and glass windows that caught the morning light. Behind it spread the bunkhouses, the barns, the corrals, the whole working machinery of a serious cattle operation. Even from a distance, you could see the organization of it, everything in its place, everything with purpose. Elias pulled Duchess to a stop at the gate and sat there for a moment. He thought about turning around. He thought about that for a good 30 seconds, and then he clicked his tongue and rode up the lane. A hand he didn't know was working the water pump near the barn. The man stopped and watched him ride up with the particular wariness of someone whose job includes paying attention to who comes through the gate. "Morning," Elias said. "Looking for Mr. Ashcroft. Is he around?" The hand studied him with flat eyes. "What for?" "Personal matter." "Personal matter?" The man repeated like he was tasting the words to see if they were any good. "He's at breakfast. Come back in an hour." "I'll wait." The hand considered that, then shrugged with the universal expression of a man who's paid to keep the cattle in, not the visitors out, and went back to his pump. Elias dismounted and tied Duchess to the hitching rail. He took off his hat, realized that was strange, put it back on. He was wearing his second-best shirt, which had been his best shirt until last spring when he'd caught a nail and torn the sleeve. He'd mended it himself, and the mend was visible if you looked. His coat was clean, his boots were clean. He had done what he could. He stood at the foot of the porch steps and waited. It took 12 minutes. He knew because he counted the seconds for the first 4 minutes, and then lost count and started over twice. By the time the front door swung open, he'd worked through 3 different versions of his opening sentence and abandoned all of them. Silas Ashcroft was a big man. Not fat, but solid. The kind of solid that comes from 40 years of physical work rather than from simply being large to begin with. He had a white beard trimmed close and gray eyes that moved over things the way a surveyor's eyes move. Measuring, calculating, marking. He was still holding his coffee cup when he came out onto the porch, and he looked at Elias the way a man looks at a fence post he doesn't remember installing. "You're one of Harlan Briggs' boys," Silas said. Not a question. "Yes, sir. Elias Boone. I've been working the broken spur 8 months." "Boone." Silas said the name once, apparently found nothing attached to it, and took a sip of his coffee. "What do you want?" Here was the part where Elias had planned to say something careful and measured, something that established his character before making his request, laid some groundwork, built toward the point rather than simply throwing it at the man's feet like a wet saddle blanket. What he actually said was, "I'd like to court your daughter, sir. Lydia. I'd like your permission to court her." Silence. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere in the barn, a horse stamped. Silas Ashcroft looked at Elias Boone with an expression that was completely, entirely unreadable. Not angry, not amused, not insulted, just still. "How old are you?" he finally said. 22. "How long you been in Montana?" 2 years, roughly. Came up from Wyoming." "What do you own?" Elias felt the question like a hand pressing on his chest, but he kept his eyes level. "My horse, my tack. $14 saved." Silas looked at Duchess at the hitching rail, taking in the bum knee, the age, the general honest plainness of her. $14, he said. "Yes, sir." Another silence. Elias had the distinct feeling that Silas was doing some kind of arithmetic in his head, the kind that had nothing to do with numbers. "Come up on the porch," Silas said. Elias came up on the porch. Silas gestured at a chair and sat down in his own. He set his coffee on the railing and laced his hands together and looked out at the yard for a moment, like he was working out how to say something. "Mr. Boone," he said, "my daughter is 20 years old. She's educated. I sent her to school in Helena 2 years. She reads. She speaks her mind, which you've probably noticed if you've spent more than 10 minutes around her." He paused. "She's going to inherit a portion of what I've built. That means whoever marries her needs to be a man capable of understanding what he's inheriting. Not just the land, but the work that built it, the decisions it takes, the kind of character it requires." He turned and looked directly at Elias. "Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" "I think so, sir." "I doubt it," Silas said without meanness. "Not yet." He picked up his coffee again. "Here's what I'm going to offer you, and I'm only going to say it once, so listen carefully." Elias listened carefully. "There's a ranch about 40 miles northeast of here, up near the Clearwater Fork. Owner's a young man named Cade Sutton, 24 years old. His father died 2 springs ago and left him the operation. About 300 acres, 60 head of cattle, a fair piece of land that should support itself if it's managed right. It's not being managed right." Silas's voice didn't carry judgment, just fact. "Sutton's a good enough boy, but he didn't learn what he needed to learn before his father passed. The operation's struggling. Going to fail in another year if something doesn't change." "All right," Elias said carefully. "I want you to go up there and work that ranch through the winter, October through March, 6 months. No wages. Sutton can't afford to pay you, and I'm not paying you. You work the land, help keep the herd alive, do what needs doing." Silas paused. "When spring comes, you come back here and we'll talk." Elias sat very still. "That's the offer," Silas said. 6 months of unpaid work on a failing ranch in the mountains, in winter, with no guarantee that anything comes of it at all. You might come back in March, and I might tell you no. I'm not promising anything." "What would you be looking for?" Elias asked. "What would you need to see?" Silas looked at him for a long moment. "I'll know it when I see it," he said, "or I won't." That was it. That was the entire answer. Elias looked out at the yard. He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, not the way a man thinks about whether to take a second helping, but the way a man thinks about something that is going to change the direction of his life, regardless of what he decides. 6 months of unpaid work. 6 months away from any pay, any progress, any certainty. 6 months on a failing ranch in the mountains during what everyone in the territory was already calling a bad winter coming. For maybe nothing. For a chance at a conversation. "I'll do it," he said. Silas raised an eyebrow. "I haven't finished." "I'll do it," Elias said again. Something passed across Silas Ashcroft's face too quickly to catch. Not approval, exactly. More like recognition. "All right," the old man said, picking up his coffee. "Sutton's expecting someone. I'll send word you're coming." He paused. "You'll want to leave by Thursday if you're going to beat the weather." Elias stood, settled his hat, and walked back down the porch steps to where Duchess was tied. His heart was doing something complicated that he didn't have a name for. He untied the mare and swung up into the saddle. "Mr. Boone." He turned. Silas was still sitting in his chair, coffee cup in hand, watching him with those measuring gray eyes. "My daughter doesn't know about this arrangement," the old rancher said. "And she won't. Not from me." Elias nodded once. "Anything else?" Silas asked. "No, sir." "Then you'd better get moving." He didn't go back to the broken spur immediately. He rode out to the flat east of town, to the open country where you could see the mountains in every direction, and he stopped Duchess on a small rise and sat there for a while. The mountains to the north had snow on them. Had for 3 weeks already. In another month, maybe less, the passes up toward the Clearwater Fork would be serious business. In 2 months, they'd be something else entirely. He thought about the conversation he'd just had, turning it over, examining it from different angles. What it came down to, stripped of everything else, was this. Silas Ashcroft had not said no. Most men in that position would have said no before Elias had finished his sentence. The fact that the old rancher had offered anything at all, even something that looked from most angles like a very elaborate rejection, meant something. Either Silas was a cruel man who enjoyed watching young men chase impossible things, or he was a man who had decided to take Elias Boone seriously enough to give him a genuine test. Elias didn't think Silas Ashcroft was cruel. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. a worn thing his mother had made him from a piece of leather when he was 16 the year before she died. He opened it and counted. $14 even. 3 weeks' wages minus what he'd spent on supplies and the new sole on his left boot. $14? A 12-year-old horse with a bad knee, a mended shirt, and 6 months of unpaid work in the mountains. He put the wallet away. "All right, Duchess," he said quietly. "Let's go figure out what we've gotten ourselves into." He told Harlan that evening. His boss took the news with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that expressing strong reactions doesn't usually improve a situation. "Ashcroft's sending you up to the Sutton place," Harlan said. "That's right. For the winter, no pay." "That's right." Harlan leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "And the reason you're doing this is because you want to court Lydia Ashcroft." "Yes." "Elias." Harlan said his name with the weight of a man choosing his words carefully. "I'm not going to tell you what to do. You're a grown man and a good hand, and I'll be sorry to lose you for the winter, even temporary, but I want to ask you something." "All right. Do you actually know that girl?" Elias thought about the pie and fork moment at the social, about the 7 encounters, about the way she'd looked at him when he caught her horse's bridle. That measuring look. "Not enough," he admitted. "Then why?" It was a fair question, and Elias sat with it for a moment before he answered. "Because I'd like to," he finally said, "and I won't get the chance if I don't do this." Harlan studied him. "And if you do all this and he still says no, then I'll have spent a winter on a mountain learning something." Another silence. "Can't argue with that," Harlan said finally, though his tone suggested he could argue with it quite a bit if he chose to. He stood up and put out his hand. "Your job's here when you come back. If you come back, don't let that mountain make that decision for you." "I won't." They shook hands. That was that. Dip. He spent 2 days preparing, gathering what gear he could, making sure Duchess's knee wrap was in good shape, buying what supplies he could afford, and making a list of what he'd need to find at the Sutton place. He slept both nights in the bunkhouse, listening to the familiar sounds of the place. Calloway's snoring, the cattle settling, the creak of the building in the wind, and tried not to think too hard about what 6 months of silence in the mountains was going to feel like. On his last evening, he did something he hadn't quite planned. He wrote Lydia Ashcroft a letter. He sat at the small desk in the corner of the bunkhouse, with the lamp turned low so he wouldn't wake the others, and he wrote. It took him 4 tries because he kept either saying too much or saying nothing at all, and it took him a long time to find the middle ground. What he finally settled on was short, shorter than he'd expected when he started. "Miss Ashcroft, I spoke with your father on Monday regarding permission to call on you. He has offered me an arrangement, which I have accepted. I will be away from Millhaven through the winter on account of it. I wanted you to know since it seemed wrong to simply disappear without a word. I apologize if this letter is forward. I don't know what the proper etiquette is for a situation like this, and I suspect there isn't one. Your father hasn't given me any promises. I thought you should know that too. Respectfully, Elias Boone." He folded it and addressed it to her at the Ashcroft Ranch and slipped it into the pocket of his coat to mail in the morning. Then he blew out the lamp and lay in the dark and listened to the wind, which had gotten colder. Thursday came gray and raw, with the smell of something serious on the air. He loaded his saddlebags, checked Duchess's knee one more time, tied his bedroll behind the saddle, and rode north out of Millhaven as the sun was still trying to decide whether to bother coming up. 3 miles out, he passed the turnoff for the Ashcroft Ranch without looking at it. He didn't look at it, but he was aware of it the way you're aware of a sound that stops, by its absence, by the space where it had been. 40 miles. The mountains getting bigger as he rode toward them, gray and white, the sky the color of old pewter. He had no idea what he was riding into. That, he supposed, was probably the point. That's it. The trail north was not a road so much as a suggestion. 40 miles as the crow flies became closer to 55 once you accounted for the terrain. The creek crossings, the switchbacks up the first ridge, the long traverse across an exposed bench where the wind hit like something with intent. Elias rode through the first day at a steady pace, not pushing Duchess on account of the knee, making camp after dark in a stand of pines where the trees blocked the worst of the wind. He built a small fire, ate cold biscuits and salt pork because he was too tired to cook properly, and fell asleep with his back against his saddle, listening to the pines. He dreamed of nothing in particular. That was fine. Sometimes nothing in particular was the most restful kind of dream. The second day, the weather came down on him. Not snow yet, but the kind of cold, damp wind that feels like practice for something worse. He kept his head down and his pace steady and thought about the practical problem in front of him, which was easier than thinking about the larger questions. What he knew about the Sutton Ranch? Not much. 60 head, Silas had said. 300 acres, up near the Clearwater Fork. A young owner who didn't know enough. Beyond that, he was working from nothing. What he knew about surviving a hard winter on a struggling ranch. More than most 22-year-olds, he thought, though not as much as he'd like. He'd grown up on a small farm in Kansas, helped his father, and then worked alone after his father's drinking made him unreliable. He'd learned by necessity, fencing, doctoring livestock, reading weather, fixing what broke without waiting for someone else to fix it. He'd come west because the opportunities seemed better and the failures seemed more interesting, and he'd been right about both. He could do this. He told himself that on the second day, and mostly believed it. On the third day, he found the Sutton Ranch. He smelled it before he saw it, or rather, he smelled what was wrong with it. Cattle, yes, that familiar complex smell of hide and manure and hay, but underneath it, something slightly wrong. The particular sour smell of animals under stress, of a place not quite staying ahead of its problems. The ranch came into view as he crested a small rise, a narrow valley maybe half a mile across, a frozen creek running through the middle, timber on the slopes above, and in the flat center a collection of buildings that told a story at a glance. The story was, built well, maintained poorly. The main house was solid, good logs, tight construction, the work of a man who'd known what he was doing, but one corner of the barn roof had developed a visible sag. The fence line he could see from the rise had at least 3 sections that needed work. The woodpile beside the house was small for this time of year. A skinny dog watched him from the porch, with the resigned expression of a creature that has lowered its expectations significantly. Elias rode down into the valley. The man who came out of the barn when he heard the horse was younger than Elias had expected, even knowing he was 24. Cade Sutton was lean to the point of gaunt, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of eyes that have been chronically short on sleep. He had a piece of hay stuck to his shirt. He was holding a rope splint he'd clearly been in the middle of working on and forgot about when Elias appeared. They looked at each other. "You're from Ashcroft," Cade said. Not a question. Nobody else would be riding up here from the south this late in the season. "Elias Boone," Elias said, and swung down off Duchess. "You're Cade Sutton." "That's right." Cade's handshake was firm, but his hand was cold. He'd been working without gloves. "I didn't know when you'd come. Silas said sometime in October." "Here I am." Cade looked at him for a moment with an expression Elias couldn't entirely read, somewhere between relief and something more guarded, a man trying to figure out what kind of help he was getting before he trusted it. "Your horse looks tired," Cade finally said. 40-mile ride and a bad knee," Elias said. "She'll be all right once she's rested." "Come on, then." Cade turned back toward the barn. "I'll show you where you'll be staying. Then we can—" He paused, and something shifted in his face, some calculation happening fast behind his eyes. "Then I'll show you around, show you what we're working with." Elias followed him into the barn. He took in everything quickly, the way he'd learned to take in a new situation, cataloging, assessing, sorting problems into categories. The cattle he could see from the barn door looked thin, not emergency thin, but thin enough to worry about over a long winter. The hay supply, from what he could see, was probably adequate if they were careful and the winter was normal. If the winter wasn't normal, it was a different conversation. The stalls needed mucking. The water trough had a slow leak somebody had patched badly. The rope splint Cade had been working on was for a calf. He could see it in the far stall, lying down, not in crisis, but not right either. He filed all of it away. "How many head are you running?" he asked. "Started the summer with 63. Lost 2 in September. 1 to a broken leg, 1 just up and died. Couldn't figure why. 61 now." "All right. The hay should be enough," Cade said, with the tone of a man who's told himself this enough times to be suspicious of it. "If we don't have too many bad weeks." "How many weeks did you put up?" Cade told him. Elias did the math in his head. The math was not comfortable. We should talk about that, Elias said. Cade looked at him sideways. I know. They showed each other their hands, the way two strangers do when they realize they're going to have to trust each other, whether they want to or not. The bunk Elias was given was in a small room off the back of the barn, originally built as a tack room, converted to sleeping quarters at some point with varying degrees of success. It was cold. The single window leaked wind around its frame, something he stuffed with rags his second day. The mattress was corn husk, which was fine. He'd slept on worse. That first night, after they'd eaten a simple supper of beans and cornbread in a kitchen that was clean but sparse, and talked through the basic situation of the ranch. And it was exactly as marginal as it looked from the outside, which Cade admitted with the particular dignity of a person who has given up pretending otherwise. Elias sat on his bunk and listened to the silence. It was the loudest silence he'd ever been in. The mountains had a way of amplifying quiet. You could hear the creek somewhere below the barn, still running under its ice. You could hear the cattle shifting in their stalls. You could hear the wind beginning to look for gaps in the walls. He thought about Millhaven, 40-odd miles south. He thought about Silas Ashcroft on his porch with his coffee. He thought, you see, because he was human and 22 and couldn't help it, about Lydia, about whether she'd gotten his letter, about what she'd made of it. He hadn't promised her anything. He wasn't sure he had anything to promise. He had $14 and a plan made of mostly air, and the only thing between him and that air was 6 months of work with no guarantee at the end. He lay back on the corn husk mattress and stared at the ceiling. I'll know it when I see it, Silas had said. All right then. Elias closed his eyes. Outside, the wind picked up. The mountains pressed down all around, and up near the Clearwater Fork, with the first real snow of winter still 3 weeks out. But coming, definitely coming, a 22-year-old man with $14 and a plan made of air went to sleep and tried not to dream about what he might lose if the plan fell apart. He didn't sleep well. That was probably wise. In the weeks that followed, Elias learned the ranch the way you learn any hard thing, slowly, by getting it wrong first. He learned that the south pasture fence had a section that looked repaired but wasn't, just pushed back together and hoped into submission. He fixed it properly on his 4th day, in a cold rain, with Cade watching and asking questions that Elias answered without impatience because the questions were good questions. He learned that the water situation was more precarious than it first appeared. The main trough leak was the symptom, not the disease. The pipe from the creek had a crack further up that was going to become a serious problem in hard freeze. He learned that Cade Sutton was not stupid or lazy, just trained by the wrong school, which was the school of watching his father do things without understanding why. That was fixable. Ignorance usually was. Why are we running them in the south pasture? Elias asked one morning, midway through his 2nd week. They were moving cattle, a job that went faster now that they'd found a working rhythm. Cade looked at him. That's where my father always wintered them. The wind comes from the north. South pasture's exposed. You've got those timber draws up on the north slope. Cattle will drift into those naturally in a storm. You'd lose less body weight if they had some shelter. Cade was quiet for a moment, processing this. My father always... I know, Elias said. What did your father know about why he did it that way? A pause. I don't know. He didn't explain much. He just did things. All right? Elias kept moving the cattle, didn't make it a moment. So we're figuring it out as we go. That's fine. Let's think about where these animals are going to be happiest in February. That evening, Cade moved the herd to the north draw. It was a small thing, but it was the beginning of something. The first letter from Lydia came in early November, carried up by the mail rider who made the run to Clearwater Fork once every 2 weeks. It was brief, briefer than his, even, written in a hand that was precise and slightly slanted, like the writer was thinking faster than the pen could keep up. Mr. Boone, I received your letter. My father told me nothing, which is consistent with how my father operates. I hope the work is not too difficult, though I suspect it is. I hope your horse's knee is holding up in the cold. I don't know what the proper etiquette is either, but since we've established that, I'll just say, I'm glad you wrote. Regards, L. Ashcroft. He read it 4 times, then he folded it carefully and put it in the breast pocket of his coat, where it stayed for the rest of that day and several days after. Outside, the mountains sat in their cold silence, enormous and indifferent, and the first real snow began to fall. November settled in with its teeth showing. The snow came not dramatically but persistently, a few inches here, a few inches there, the kind of accumulation that doesn't announce itself as a problem until you wake up one morning and realize the problem has been building quietly for weeks. Elias worked. That was the simple version of the next 6 weeks. He worked from before light until after dark, and sometimes in the dark itself, when something needed doing that couldn't wait for morning. He repaired the north fence line in temperatures that made the nails hurt to touch. He wrestled the pipe crack into submission with Cade's help and the judicious application of everything they had available, plus a few solutions that a sensible man probably wouldn't have tried. He doctored the calf with the bad leg, a process that involved more failures than successes before finally working, and taught Cade what to look for when an animal was going wrong before it went too far wrong. Cade learned fast when someone explained the why behind things. That was what Elias discovered, and it changed how he worked with him. The young rancher wasn't looking for someone to do the job for him. He was looking for someone to close the gaps his father's sudden death had left, to fill in the understanding he'd never had a chance to build. Every time Elias explained why they were doing something a particular way, Cade filed it somewhere permanent. You could see it happening, could see him connecting the instruction to some larger understanding he was constructing. It was, Elias thought, like watching someone build a house from the inside. "How do you know all this?" Cade asked one evening. They were in the barn, treating a heifer for foot rot in the yellow lamplight, and Cade was watching Elias work with the close attention he brought to everything now. "I don't know all of it," Elias said. "I know what I've had to learn." "You grew up on a farm?" "Kansas. Small place. My father—" He paused, considering how much to say. "My father had some difficulties. So I learned young." Cade absorbed that, didn't push it. "Did you always want to come west?" Elias thought about Kansas, about the flatland and the sky, and the particular quality of the silence there, which was different from the mountain silence here. "I wanted to see what else there was," he said finally. "I don't know if that's the same thing." Cade was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're doing this for Lydia Ashcroft." Elias kept working on the heifer's foot. "Silas told me," Cade said. "Not much, just that he was sending a man up who needed to work for the winter, and the reason why." He paused. "He didn't tell me what to think about it, just told me." "What do you think about it?" Elias asked, genuinely curious. Cade considered. "I think it's one of the more honest things I've seen a man do in a while," he said finally. "Most men would have just, I don't know, found a different girl, one with a father who didn't make it so hard." "Maybe," Elias said, "but you're here." "But I'm here." They finished with the heifer in comfortable silence. And outside, the mountains went on being enormous and cold and indifferent, which was what mountains did. December brought the second letter from Lydia, and Elias found that he'd been waiting for it without quite admitting to himself that he was waiting. She wrote about Mill Haven. Small things. The kind of details you'd never think to include in a letter if you were trying to say something important, but which somehow said more than the important things. The Hendersons' new baby, who cried every night and could apparently be heard from 2 houses away. The argument at the land council meeting, which she'd heard secondhand from Thomas, and which sounded, she wrote, exactly like every argument men have about land, which is to say it was mostly about pride dressed up as principle. The early December snow that had made the road to town impassable for 3 days, during which she'd reread 2 books she'd already read, organized the pantry 3 times, and taught herself to braid a rope just to have something to do. "I am not," she wrote, "a person who handles enforced stillness with any grace whatsoever. My mother says I have my father's restlessness. I think that's supposed to be a criticism, but I'm not entirely sure." He wrote back that evening, sitting at the small table in the barn room with the lamp close to keep warm. He wrote about the cattle, about the pipe repair, about the calf with the bad leg who was now walking without a limp and had developed an uncanny ability to escape from any enclosure they put him in, which had become a running joke between him and Cade. He wrote that the mountains were very large and very quiet, and that he was learning to respect both qualities. He wrote, "I think your mother might have meant it as a criticism, but the trait seems useful to me. Restlessness is just unspent energy, and unspent energy is just a problem looking for a solution. He stared at that last sentence for a while, wondering if it was too much, and then sent it anyway because he was tired and the lamp was burning down, and frankly, he had nothing left to lose by being honest. He fell asleep before the lamp went out. Christmas came and went with little ceremony. He and Cade ate a better dinner than usual. Cade had been given a smoked ham by a neighboring rancher, payment for help with some fencing, and toasted the season with coffee because neither of them drank. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. There was a comfortable quality to the silence between them now, the silence of two people who've spent enough time in the same difficulty to understand each other without narrating it. Elias thought about his mother, who had died when he was 16 with her hands still rough from work, and her face still carrying what he thought was the expression of someone who had expected something better and was disappointed but not surprised. He missed her at odd moments, not with the sharp grief he'd felt in the first years, but with the duller, more permanent feeling of a thing that's simply always going to be part of you. He thought about his father, who was probably still in Kansas, probably still making bad decisions, probably still pretending the farm could be saved if circumstances would just cooperate. He didn't miss his father exactly. He more carried him. The way you carry a lesson you didn't want to learn. Watching his father choose the easier wrong thing over the harder right thing, year after year, had installed something in Elias that he couldn't really name. A reflex, maybe, an automatic pull toward the harder choice. Not because he was noble, just because he'd seen what the other road looked like and didn't want to end up there. "You all right?" Cade asked, watching him. "Fine," Elias said. "Good dinner." Cade nodded. They finished their coffee. Outside, the snow fell straight down in the still air. Quiet, serious, committing. And January waited just 3 days away with whatever it had planned. Well, it had plenty planned, as it turned out. January in the Clearwater Valley was a different thing from November and December. November was winter arriving. December was winter settling in. January was winter showing what it actually was, without politeness or preamble. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a day and stayed there. The creek froze solid. 3 sections of the north fence came down under ice weight, and Elias and Cade spent 2 brutal days in conditions that made Elias's hands go white and then red, and then a dull complaining ache that lasted for a week, rebuilding what the ice had knocked down. 2 cattle died, cold primarily, but aggravated by the fact that they'd gone into winter a little thin from the poor summer management. It couldn't have been prevented entirely, but it might have been prevented if things had been different. And Cade took both losses with a grim quiet that told Elias the young man was doing his own accounting, working out what he'd done wrong and what he was going to do differently. Elias didn't try to comfort him on that. A man working out his mistakes didn't need comfort. He needed space to work them out. "What did I miss?" Cade asked the evening of the second loss, sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup. Elias sat down across from him. "You went into winter with thin cattle because summer got away from you. That was a decision that happened in July, not January." Cade looked at him. "What do you mean, got away from me?" "The south pasture. You were running them there when the north draw had better summer grass. I'm guessing you moved the herd when your father always moved the herd, not when the grass said to." A long pause. "Yeah. That's July's mistake. This is just January collecting it." He paused. "Doesn't mean it's not your fault. It means you know what to fix." Cade was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you—" He stopped. Started again. "How do you keep from taking it personally?" It was a real question, asked with real confusion, and Elias took it seriously. "I do take it personally," he said. "I just try to figure out whether that's useful or not. If it makes me work harder and smarter, fine. If it just makes me feel bad, then it's not useful, and I put it away." Cade looked at the table for a while. "That sounds easier than it is," he finally said. "Most things do," Elias agreed. February brought Lydia's 3rd letter, which had clearly taken some time to find him given the conditions. It arrived creased and slightly damp, and he handled it more carefully than its material composition strictly warranted. She wrote that her father had received letters from neighboring ranchers, men who'd apparently been keeping an eye on the Sutton place for reasons she didn't specify. She wrote that she didn't know what the letters said. She wrote that her father read them at breakfast and said nothing, which she had concluded was either a very good sign or a very bad sign, and she couldn't figure out which. She wrote, "I have been thinking about what you said about restlessness being unspent energy. I think that's true, but I think you left something out. Unspent energy is only useful if you know what problem you're supposed to be solving. I have approximately 11 unspent problems worth of energy, and I'm not sure what any of the problems are yet. That's the less comfortable version of the feeling." He read that 3 times and sat with it for a while. Then he wrote back, "I think not knowing the problem yet is the most honest position. Most people who think they know their problem have just picked the most obvious-looking one and aren't sure there isn't something better. Maybe unspent energy looking for its problem is just potential, and that's not a bad thing to be." He read it over, thought about it, and sent it. Then he went back to work, because work was what he had, and winter wasn't finished with them yet, and there were 61 reasons out in that snow that needed a person paying attention. So, he didn't know that Silas Ashcroft had been reading the letters from his neighbors, the ones about the quiet young man up at the Sutton place. He didn't know that Hector Bridges, whose land abutted the Sutton property on the east, had written that the Boone boy had pulled 3 of Bridges's own stray cattle out of a ravine in a blizzard without being asked and without mentioning it afterward. He didn't know that Frank Dawson, passing through on his way to his lumber camp, had stopped at the Sutton place for a night and had written to Silas that he'd found a young rancher who knew what he was doing, a young rancher who hadn't been there 8 weeks ago. He didn't know any of that. He knew the fence line needed another check before the storm coming in from the northwest made it impossible. He knew that the heifer with the foot rot needed her foot looked at again. He knew that Cade had started waking up at 4:30 without being asked, which meant something had changed somewhere in the young rancher's understanding of what his life required. And he knew, in the way you know a thing without being able to prove it, that somewhere 40 miles south, in a house with glass windows that caught the morning light, a man with gray measuring eyes was waiting to see what winter would produce. So he went back to work. The storm came in 3 days later, harder than anyone had expected. But that was February's business, and Elias Boone was learning to deal with 1 month at a time. The storm that hit the Clearwater Fork in mid-February announced itself the way serious storms usually did. Not with drama, but with a particular quality of stillness that came before it. The air going heavy and strange, the cattle restless in a way that had nothing to do with hunger or cold, and everything to do with whatever sense animals carry that humans have mostly lost. Elias noticed it mid-afternoon on a Tuesday. He was patching a section of the east fence line when he stopped working and looked north. The sky up there had gone the color of a dirty sheet, low and flat, the mountains behind it completely swallowed. The wind had died an hour ago. That was the thing that bothered him. Not the clouds, but the absence of wind. In his experience, when the wind stopped before a storm, it meant the storm was deciding how serious it wanted to be. He pulled the last staple tight and started back toward the barn at a pace that was faster than walking without being a run. Cade was in the barn when he came in, forking hay. He looked up and read Elias's face before Elias said anything. "How bad?" Cade asked. "Don't know yet. Bad enough to get the animals in and the hay covered before it hits." They spent the next 2 hours moving fast, not talking much. There was a language to working alongside someone in an emergency that had nothing to do with words. Where one person went, the other didn't. What needed doing next came clear from what had just been done. And any time wasted on discussion was time the storm was spending getting closer. They'd found that language somewhere around late November, the two of them, without ever naming it. The snow started at dusk. Within an hour it was coming sideways. By midnight, Elias could barely see the main house from the barn door, and the temperature had dropped to something beyond what a thermometer really needed to document. He and Cade sat in the barn with the animals because the barn was warmer than the house, and because neither of them was going to sleep through this anyway, and they listened to the storm work on the roof and the walls and try to find a way in. "This is the worst one yet," Cade said. He was sitting on an overturned bucket, his coat still on, his breath visible even in the lamplight. "Probably," Elias agreed. "We got everything in?" "Everything I could find." He paused. "I'm worried about the 3 that were working the north draw when it hit. I didn't get eyes on all of them before the visibility went." Cade was quiet. "What do we do?" "Wait for first light, then go look." Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that first light might not tell them anything good. They sat with the animals and the lamp and the sound of the storm, and the night went by the way bad nights go. Slowly, and full of things you can't fix until you can. First light was a generous term for what arrived at 7 the next morning. It was more like the darkness becoming a slightly lighter shade of gray. Enough to see the barn door when you opened it, enough to see the snow packed against the fence rails in drifts that reached the top post in places. Enough to see that the world had reorganized itself overnight, and they were going to have to learn it again. Elias went out. He told Cade to stay and tend the animals, and Cade didn't argue, which meant Cade had gotten smart enough to know that 2 people floundering in waist-deep snow was worse than 1 person doing it carefully. He found 2 of the 3 cattle fairly quickly, sheltered in the timber draw the way cattle with any sense did. The third took him 40 minutes in conditions that made those 40 minutes longer than most hours he'd lived. He found her wedged against a drift in the far corner of the north fence, still standing, deeply unhappy, but standing. He got a rope on her and worked her out of the drift by increments, one slow, patient step at a time, talking to her in the same low tone he used with Duchess, because it was the only thing he had to offer. When he got back to the barn, Cade looked at him, and then looked at the snow-caked rope and the snow-caked cow, and then at Elias again. "You look terrible," Cade said. "Thank you," Elias said, and tied the cow in her stall and went to find dry gloves. That was how February went. The storm lasted 4 days, not continuously dumping snow, but cycling, a few hours of brutal intensity followed by a deceptive calm that would break again without warning. They lost 1 calf to the cold during that stretch, a young one that had been a little weak from the start and couldn't hold enough heat. Cade found it in the morning, and he stood over it for a moment with an expression that Elias gave him space to have. There was nothing to say about it. These things happened. The only thing you could control was whether you'd done everything possible beforehand, and they had. Sometimes that still wasn't enough. "Put it over by the fence," Elias said quietly. "We'll deal with it when the ground's workable." Cade did. Then they went back to work. Because the living animals needed the attention that grief was going to spend on the dead one if you let it. By the time the storm broke fully and the sun came back, painful and white, and bouncing off 4 feet of new snow with a brightness that made your eyes water, the ranch looked like a different place. The familiar shapes were gone or changed, the landmarks buried, the fence lines visible only as slight suggestions beneath the white. They spent 3 days just digging out, getting the paths clear, finding what the snow had bent or broken. The south fence had 2 new failures. The woodshed had lost a section of roof under the weight. One of the old fence posts in the north line had snapped clean off at the base, which meant the whole section needed resetting. Cade looked at the fence post, looked at the list of things that needed doing, looked at the sky where another set of clouds was beginning to build on the northwestern horizon, and said nothing for a long moment. "We should start with the north fence," Elias said. "That's the critical one." Cade looked at him. "When does it get easier?" It was an honest question, asked without self-pity, but with genuine exhaustion, and Elias gave it a real answer. "The work doesn't get easier. You get better at it. Those aren't the same thing." Cade looked at the broken fence post again. "That's not as comforting as it probably sounds in your head." "No," Elias admitted, "probably not." But Cade picked up the post hole digger and went to work, and that was what mattered. They fixed the north fence in 2 days, working in temperatures that climbed above freezing for the first time in weeks, briefly, tentatively, like the cold wasn't sure yet whether to let go. The melt made the ground muddy in the top layer and still frozen 6 inches down, which made digging genuinely difficult and genuinely bad for the back. Elias's hands had gone from the constant ache of deep winter to a newer, different ache of thawing and refreezing, and he'd stopped thinking about them as a comfort problem and started thinking of them as just a condition of existence, the way you stop noticing road noise after a few hours of driving. It was around this time that he got Lydia's 4th letter. He almost missed it. The mail rider came through on a Wednesday, and Elias was out checking the south fence and didn't know he'd come until Cade mentioned it at supper in the way Cade had taken to mentioning things, casually and without emphasis, as if the information were not the kind that caused a man to reach for the envelope sitting on the table with slightly more speed than was dignified. He read it later, in the barn room, with the lamp turned up as high as it would go. She wrote that her father had come home from a land council meeting in a different mood than usual. Quieter, she said, which in Silas Ashcroft could mean any number of things, none of them easily read. She wrote that she'd overheard one side of a conversation between her father and Thomas, her brother, in which the name Sutton was mentioned, and then her father had said something she couldn't make out, and Thomas had laughed in a way that she had learned over 20 years meant Thomas was surprised and impressed simultaneously. She wrote, "I don't know what that means, or if it means anything. I'm telling you because it seemed like the kind of thing you should know, even if neither of us can say what to do with it." Then she wrote something that he read 3 times, slowly. "I've been trying to figure out what I actually know about you, after all these letters. Here's what I have. You fix things rather than complaining about them. You're honest in a way that doesn't seem like it costs you anything, which I suspect means you've practiced it until it became a habit. You care about that ranch hand's horse the same way you care about the cattle, which tells me something. And you write like someone who's been thinking about things for a long time without anyone to say them to. I don't know if any of that is the kind of thing worth knowing, but I've been thinking about it." He folded the letter and held it for a while. Outside the barn, the wind was moving again, lighter now than it had been for weeks. The cattle were quiet. Somewhere above, the sky was doing something, clearing maybe, or just resting. He wrote back the following night. He wrote about the storm, about the 4 days of it, and the calf they'd lost, and the fence posts, and the hours in waist-deep snow looking for one stubborn cow. He wrote about Cade, about watching the young man become something different than what he'd been when Elias arrived. Not transformed, nothing that clean, but incrementally more certain of himself, more able to read what the land was asking and respond to it without panicking. He wrote, "You said I write like someone who's been thinking without anyone to say things to. That's accurate. I've spent most of my adult life in the company of cattle and working men, which are both good company, but neither of them ask you to think out loud very often. These letters are the most I've talked about anything that wasn't fence posts or weather in probably 2 years. I'm not sure if that's sad or just true." He paused over that last line, then left it in. He wrote, "What you said about knowing things about a person from what they write, I think that's right. I think you can see something in the way a person says things that you can't always see when you're face to face. I don't know if what you see in these letters is accurate. I hope it's close." He sent it before he could think about it too much. March was still weeks away. But something had shifted, some internal weather, and he noticed it the same way he'd noticed the pre-storm stillness in February. Not with certainty, but with the sense that the air had changed and that what came next was going to be different from what had come before. The question was whether different meant better. He went to sleep without knowing the answer to that, which was, he was learning, just the condition of being a person who was trying to do something that mattered. Cade noticed the change in Elias's mood before Elias had fully acknowledged it to himself, because Cade had become a more attentive person than he'd been in October, and this was one of the things attentive people did. "Letter from Millhaven?" Cade asked the morning after, not looking up from the harness he was mending. Elias, who was measuring rope, didn't answer immediately. "You don't have to tell me," Cade said. "It's not a secret," Elias said. "Yes." Cade nodded, mended another inch of harness. "My father used to say that the best thing that could happen to a man going through something hard was someone on the other side of it who was paying attention." He paused. "I didn't really understand what he meant when he said it. I think I understand it better now." Elias looked at him. "I mean her," Cade said simply, without embarrassment. "I mean, you're easier to work with after those letters. You don't go inside yourself as much." He seemed to sense that he'd said enough and went back to the harness. Elias thought about that for the rest of the morning. He didn't go inside himself as much. He hadn't thought of it that way, but it was probably true. The letters had given him something to come back to at the end of the days. Not an escape exactly, but a point of orientation. The way a distant light works when you're trying to walk straight across dark ground. You're not going toward the light, you're just using it to know you're not drifting. The last hard weeks of February gave way to March, with the reluctance of something that's invested a lot of effort in being what it is and doesn't see why it should change. The days got longer, slowly, by minutes rather than hours, but the cold held. The snow had settled and crusted and was not going anywhere soon, which made everything heavier to move through and harder on the livestock, who were starting to feel the long months in the quality of their coats, and the way they moved, and the dull incuriosity of animals that have been cold for too long. Elias pushed the work harder through March, trying to stay ahead of the exhaustion that comes at the end of a long winter when everything you've been doing on willpower starts running a tab. He was tired in a way that sleep didn't entirely fix. The deep structural tiredness of months of sustained effort, the kind that requires actual rest, warmth, and the absence of things that need doing at 4 in the morning. He didn't get much of any of those things, but he kept the list of things going wrong shorter than the list of things working, which was the best available definition of success. Cade worked alongside him without complaint. More than without complaint. Cade had developed a quality Elias hadn't expected when he arrived, which was initiative. He stopped waiting to be told what needed doing. He started arriving at the same conclusions Elias arrived at, sometimes before Elias got there. One morning, Elias came out to find that Cade had already reinforced the weak section of the east fence because he'd noticed the same things Elias had noticed the day before and had simply gone ahead. He didn't mention it. He was having breakfast when Elias came in, and he nodded, and that was the whole conversation. It was the best kind of progress, the kind that doesn't make a speech about itself. The neighbors had been watching. Elias didn't know this in any precise way, but he could feel it in the occasional appearance of someone from a neighboring spread, riding past on business that didn't strictly require them to ride past the Sutton place, stopping for a few minutes, talking about nothing in particular with the slightly too casual quality of people who are actually looking at something while they talk about nothing. He said what he had to say and did what he had to do and didn't perform anything for anybody, partly because he wasn't built for performance, and partly because he understood, in the way you understand things that nobody's explained to you directly, that the performance was beside the point. One afternoon in mid-March, Hector Bridges came by with a purpose. He was a solid man in his 50s, one of the established ranchers of the valley, a man who had seen several versions of the Sutton property over the years and clearly had opinions about all of them. He stood in the yard, looking around, taking inventory the way experienced ranchers do, not rudely, just professionally, the way a doctor looks at a patient before saying anything. "Heard you've had a hard winter up here," he said. "Hard winter everywhere," Elias said. "True enough." Bridges looked at the fence line, the barn, the cattle visible in the north draw. "That fence wasn't in that condition 2 months ago." "No, sir, it wasn't." "You do that?" "Cade and I did it together." Bridges looked at him in a way that said he'd noted the answer carefully. Sutton's boy turning into something up here. He's got good instincts. Needed someone to help him see how to use them. Another look. "You make that sound easy." "It wasn't particularly easy," Elias said. Bridges almost smiled. He looked at the cattle again. "Going to be a decent herd come spring. Man who came through in December said Sutton was going to lose half of them. He's not going to lose half of them." "No." Bridges nodded slowly. He turned and looked at Elias with the direct attention of someone who's made up his mind to say something. "Silas Ashcroft asked me to keep an eye on this place," he said. "I want you to know that, because I think you probably figured it out already, and a man ought to be told what he probably already knows." He paused. "I've written him 2 letters. I'm going to write him a 3rd one this week." Elias waited. "That's all I'm going to say about it," Bridges said, which was, Elias thought, plenty. The older rancher remounted his horse, tipped his hat, and rode back down the valley. Elias watched him go and stood in the yard for a moment afterward, in the cold, late winter air, the mountains around him still heavy with snow, but with something changed in the light. The particular quality of light that comes in March, not warm exactly, but warmer, angled differently, like the sun has remembered what it's supposed to be doing and is getting back to it. He thought about the letter Bridges would write to Silas Ashcroft. He thought about Silas reading it with his morning coffee, with his measuring gray eyes, thinking whatever it was that Silas thought. He thought about March ending and April coming and the ride back south. He thought about the fact that after all of this, the storms, the frozen pipes, the lost calf, the months of work, the letters written in lamplight, he would ride back to Millhaven with exactly what he'd left with. $14, worn clothes, 1 reliable horse, nothing that looked like anything from the outside. He turned and went back to the barn, because there was still work left, and work was the only language this whole situation had ever actually spoken. 3 weeks before the end of his assignment, something happened that he didn't expect. Cade found him at the water trough one evening, fixing the seal on the pipe for what had to be the 5th time that winter, and stood there for a moment in the awkward way of someone who has something to say, and isn't sure of the approach. "What is it?" Elias asked without looking up. "I want to ask you something, and I don't know if it's the right thing to ask." Elias finished tightening the fitting and stood up. "Ask it anyway." Cade was quiet for a moment. Then, "Would you, if this works out with Ashcroft, if he says yes, would you consider staying on, not working for Ashcroft? Here, with me?" He said it fast, like he'd been holding it for a while and needed to get it out before it got heavier. "I can't pay you what you'd be worth, not yet. But the spring contracts are going to be better than last year, and if we can get through calving strong and—" "Cade?" Elias said. Cade stopped. "Let me get through March first." A pause, then Cade nodded, looked at the ground, looked back up. "Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, of course." "It's not a no," Elias said. Something shifted in Cade's expression. Not hope exactly, but the cousin of hope, the careful preliminary emotion a person has when they're not ready to let themselves actually feel the real thing yet. "All right," Cade said. They went in for supper. They ate without talking much, the way they did most evenings now. Not from lack of things to say, but from the comfortable economy of men who've been in the same hard situation long enough that silence has become its own kind of conversation. After, Elias wrote his last letter of the winter. He wrote it slowly, taking more care than usual, choosing words the way you choose footing on uncertain ice, testing each one before committing your weight. He wrote about the approaching end of the winter, about what the valley looked like as March moved through it, about Cade asking him to stay and what that had felt like to be asked. He wrote about the long months and what they'd added up to, which wasn't what he would have predicted back in October when he'd ridden north with nothing but his horse and his saddle and a plan made of mostly air. He wrote, "I don't know what I'm coming back to. I've spent 6 months not knowing, and I've gotten somewhat better at sitting with that, but I won't pretend it doesn't press on me. What I do know is this. I left Millhaven because your father asked me to prove something. I think what he was actually asking was whether I was the kind of person who tries to prove things when nobody's keeping score. I've tried to be that. I don't know if I've managed it. I guess I'll know when I get back. I'm riding south on April 1st. If that feels like a bad omen, you can tell me when I see you." He folded the letter and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then he blew out the lamp and lay in the dark of the barn room, listening to the sounds that had become familiar over 6 months. The cattle, the creek running again beneath where the ice was breaking up, the settling of the building in the cold that was still cold but differently cold, winter cold giving way to something else underneath it. Outside, April was 12 days away. The mountains were the same mountains they'd been in October, enormous and indifferent, but Elias Boone was not the same person who'd ridden in under their shadow. He couldn't have said precisely what was different, harder in some places, softer in others, more sure of some things, less sure of others. The shape of something still being worked out. He was tired in the deep way of someone who has spent months being exactly what the situation required, and he was ready to stop being that, or at least to be at somewhere warmer, somewhere with better coffee and less wind coming through the window frame. He was also, somewhere underneath the tiredness, something that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it. The feeling a man has when he's done the thing he said he was going to do, and the doing of it has cost him something real, and he's not sure yet whether the cost was worth it, but he's starting to think it might have been. The first real thaw came 4 days later. He stood in the yard in his shirt sleeves for 10 minutes, just standing in it, feeling the sun do what sun was supposed to do, and didn't think about anything at all. That was enough, for one day. That was exactly enough. The thaw didn't last. That was the thing about March in the Clearwater Valley that Elias hadn't fully understood when he arrived in October. The month was not a clean ending to winter, but an argument between seasons, back and forth, warmth gaining ground, and then losing it, the land not sure yet which side was going to win. The 10 minutes in his shirt sleeves turned out to be the high point of a brief reprieve, and 3 days later the temperature dropped again, and the clouds came back with the particular heaviness that told you they were carrying something serious. Cade stood in the barn door the morning the sky went bad again, and looked north with an expression Elias recognized from his own face. The look of a man doing quick math on what he has left versus what might be coming. "Another one?" Cade said. Elias studied the clouds. They were lower than the February storms, which sometimes meant less snow, and sometimes meant the snow was just going to arrive faster. The wind was out of the northwest again, which was never good news up here. Maybe, he said. Could be rain, could be both. That's not a useful answer. No, Elias agreed. Let's get the cattle in the draw and the loose hay under cover. We can figure out what it is when it gets here. They moved through the morning with the efficient unhurriedness that weeks of working together had produced. Not slow, but not panicked, each of them knowing what the other was doing without having to check. Cade had gotten good at reading livestock by now, which was probably the most important thing he'd learned all winter. You couldn't manage cattle by schedules and plans. You managed them by paying attention to what they were actually doing, right now, today, which required a quality of observation that was harder to teach than any technique. The cattle were edgy. That told Elias more than the clouds did. By noon, the first snow was falling. By 2, it was serious. By 4, it was the worst storm of the winter. He knew it was the worst because he'd been through all the others, and they had not felt like this. This one had a quality to it that was hard to describe except to say that it seemed intentional. The wind driving the snow horizontally, the temperature dropping so fast that you could hear it in the way the wood contracted in the barn walls, a low, steady pressure against everything standing upright. The cattle they'd gotten into the draw were packed in tight, which was good, but tight meant one spooked animal could cause problems, and animals that cold and stressed were looking for reasons to spook. Elias was checking the north fence line, the last perimeter check before visibility went to nothing, when he heard it. A sound underneath the storm, lower than the wind, the specific sound of fence wire under too much load. He moved toward it, fighting the wind, and found what he was afraid of. A section of the north fence, the section they'd repaired in February, was bowing outward under the weight of drifted snow that had packed against it and frozen into something closer to a wall than a pile. The wire was humming with tension. The posts were moving. If that section went, the cattle in the draw would have an open path north into the timber and beyond, and finding 60 head of panicked cattle in a blizzard in the dark was not a thing that ended well. He didn't go back for Cade. There wasn't time. He went back for tools. What happened in the next hour and a half was the kind of thing that doesn't make for a good story because stories require a clean shape: beginning, crisis, resolution. And what Elias did had no clean shape. It was just work. Brutal and cold, and without pause, in conditions where every motion cost twice what it should have cost, and the result of stopping was not rest, but something worse than continuing. He drove new stakes beside the failing post to take the load. He cut the drifted snow away from the wire with the flat of a shovel, which was slow and wrong for the tool, but it was the tool he had. He rewired 2 sections where the tension had pulled staples loose, his hands working by feel more than sight, because the snow was doing what serious snow does and removing the visual world until only the immediate problem in front of your face remained. At some point, Cade appeared beside him. He didn't ask what to do. He picked up the spare post maul and started driving the stake Elias had positioned, and they worked in the howling dark without speaking because there was nothing useful to say, and they both knew it. The fence held. They stood back from it afterward, both of them breathing hard, ice in their eyebrows, Cade's hands bleeding from where the wire had gotten him through his gloves, and the fence held against the weight of the drift and the wind, not gracefully, not without complaint, but it held. "Okay," Cade said finally, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Okay," Elias agreed. They went back to the barn. Cade's hands needed wrapping. The cuts weren't deep, but they were in bad places, the kind that opened every time you flexed your fingers, and flexible fingers were something a man needed for the next 12 hours of this storm. Elias cleaned them out and wrapped them tight with the strips of clean cloth they'd kept in the barn for exactly this kind of situation, working carefully in the lamplight while Cade sat on the overturned bucket with his jaw set in the way of a man who is determined not to make a sound, because making a sound would mean admitting the thing hurt. "You could have said something," Cade said when Elias finished. "About what?" "About going out to the fence alone. There wasn't time to come back. There was time to shout." Elias tied off the last wrap and sat back. "Would you have come faster if I'd shouted?" Cade thought about that. "No, I guess not." "You came when you knew to come. That was the right time." A pause. Cade flexed his wrapped hands experimentally, decided they were functional. "Is that what your father taught you, or did you figure it out yourself?" The question landed differently than Cade probably intended. Elias was quiet for a moment, looking at the lamp. "My father," he said finally, "taught me mostly what not to do. The rest I worked out." He stood up, checked the bandage one more time out of habit. "Go check the cattle. I need to walk the east side." Cade went. Elias pulled his coat tighter and went back out into the storm. The east side was worse than he'd thought. 3 more sections of fence were under stress, not failing yet, but communicating clearly that they had opinions about the current situation, and those opinions were negative. He spent another 2 hours working through them in sequence, the kind of work that is entirely mechanical and entirely necessary, and gives the mind nothing to do except the immediate problem, which meant that somewhere around midnight, knee-deep in drifted snow and trying to reset a post by feel in the dark, Elias stopped thinking about anything except the post. That was both the hardest and easiest kind of working. Hardest because it required everything you had. Easiest because there was nothing left over for doubt. He came back in at close to 2 in the morning, found Cade asleep in the barn hay with his coat on and his wrapped hands tucked against his chest. The cattle settled around him with the indifferent warmth of large animals that have decided the emergency is over. Elias stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the scene. There was something in it. The young rancher asleep in the hay, the cattle quiet, the lamp burning low, the storm still working outside, but the inside of this place intact, that he didn't have exact words for. He'd been here 6 months. He'd arrived to find a failing operation and an underprepared owner and a list of problems that looked, in October, like it might be longer than one winter could contain. He looked around the barn at what they'd made of it since then. It wasn't fixed, exactly. Fixed implied finished, and nothing about a working ranch was ever finished. But it was alive. The cattle were alive. The fences were standing. The young rancher sleeping in the hay knew things he hadn't known in October. Knew them in the bone-deep way that only comes from doing and failing and doing again. And that knowledge was not going away when Elias rode south. He found a spot in the hay on the other side of the barn, pulled his coat tight, and closed his eyes. The storm blew through for another full day. When it finally cleared, on a Thursday morning, the sky going from white to pale gray to the fragile blue of early spring, all in about 2 hours, the valley was unrecognizable again. 4th time this winter, Elias thought. 4th time learning the shapes of a new landscape under white. They spent 2 days assessing. The tally was better than it had any right to be. All 60 head accounted for, all standing, 3 cases of early frostbite on ears and noses that needed watching, but weren't critical. The fence damage was real, but repairable. The woodshed roof, which had already lost a section in February, lost another and was now a structural question rather than a weather one. The barn was solid. Cade walked the whole perimeter on the 2nd day, taking notes in the small book he'd started keeping in January on Elias's suggestion, a practice he'd initially resisted and then adopted with the thoroughness of a convert. He came back with his list and they sat at the kitchen table and went through it together. 6 fence sections, Cade said. Woodshed roof. The gate on the south corral. The hinge froze wrong again, and I'm not going to fix it by unwinding it. I think we need to recast the fitting or replace the whole gate. He looked at his list. The heifer with the ear. I want to watch her for another week before I say she's clear. Agreed, Elias said. What am I missing? The water trough fitting's loose again. I'll look at it tomorrow. He paused. The calf with the old bad leg. He's favoring it again. Might just be the cold, but watch him. Cade wrote it down. He looked at the list for a moment, then looked at Elias. We're going to be okay, he said. Not a question. You're going to be okay, Elias said. Cade looked at him. He understood the distinction. When are you leaving? He asked. April 1st, that was what I told your neighbor. That's what I told Ashcroft. Cade nodded slowly. He looked at his notes. That's 12 days. Yes. Another nod. Okay. He didn't say anything else about it, and Elias didn't either because there wasn't much to say about it, and saying things that don't need saying was a habit neither of them had ever really developed. What they did instead was work. 12 days of it, steady and purposeful, getting through everything on the list, and a few things that had accumulated on the edge of the list without quite making it onto the official version. They rebuilt the woodshed roof in 2 days, which was faster than it should have been and involved methods that a builder would have criticized, but which held. They replaced the south corral gate, Cade cutting and fitting the timber himself with Elias checking angles and showing him twice how to set a hinge so that it wouldn't require revisiting next winter. They went through the cattle one by one, and Elias walked Cade through every assessment, every decision, not just what to do but why, because the why was what would still be there when Elias wasn't. The heifer's ear cleared. The calf with the old bad leg turned out to be stiff from the cold and walked it off in 3 days, which Elias had half expected but hadn't said because there was no point in predicting good outcomes out loud when you weren't sure of them. Hector Bridges came by again 5 days before Elias left. This time he brought his son, a younger version of himself who had the same surveyor's eyes and was learning to use them. They spent an hour looking over the ranch, asking Cade questions directly, which was different from the last visit when Bridges had directed everything at Elias, and Cade answered them with a confidence that had not been present in October and was entirely present now. Elias stayed back and let it happen. Afterward, Bridges found him by the barn. "Third letter's already gone to Silas," Bridges said. "You told me," Elias said. "I know I did. I'm telling you again so you understand what I mean by it." He paused. "My first letter said there was a man up here working hard. My second letter said the ranch was in better shape than I expected. My third letter said something different." "What did you say?" Bridges looked at him with those flat, measuring eyes. "I said the Sutton boy has got a future. And the reason he's got a future is that the man you sent up here didn't spend the winter looking after himself. He spent it building something that was going to outlast him." Elias didn't say anything. "That's not as common as it should be," Bridges said. He put out his hand and Elias shook it. "Good luck with Ashcroft. He's a hard man, but he's a fair one." Bridges rode out with his son. Elias stood by the barn for a long time after. He hadn't thought of it the way Bridges had described it. He'd thought of it as just work, as the logical thing to do in a situation that required doing, as the choice his father never made, and therefore the choice that had crystallized for him early into something that felt less like virtue and more like instinct. You didn't leave people worse off than you found them if you could help it. That wasn't nobility. That was just basic mathematics applied to human situations. But hearing it said back to him in Bridges' flat voice, he spent it building something that was going to outlast him, did something to him that he sat with quietly for the rest of that afternoon. The last night came without ceremony, the way last nights usually did. They ate supper, talked about the spring schedule, went over the calving calendar that Cade now understood well enough to manage without guidance. The fire was good, the food was adequate. The coffee was better than it had been all winter because Cade had traded some labor with a neighboring woman for a better grade of beans, and neither of them had commented on this, but both of them had noticed it. "You remember what you told me," Cade said eventually, "that night after we lost the 2 cattle in February?" "Which part?" "That knowing what to fix is different from having fixed it." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I think about that. And I think you were right. But I also think the knowing is actually the harder part. The fixing is just, you put in the work. But knowing what actually went wrong, knowing it clearly enough that you don't do it again." He stopped. "That takes something else." Elias looked at him. "What does it take?" Cade thought about it. "Honesty, I guess. With yourself. Most people I've seen, they'll work hard. But when something goes wrong, they'd rather find a reason outside themselves. Weather, luck, other people." He paused. "My father did that. I do it too sometimes. I'm trying not to." It was the most personal thing Cade had said all winter. Elias received it the way it was offered, directly, without making it into a bigger moment than it was. "Most people do," Elias said. "Trying not to is the whole work." They finished their coffee. Elias washed the cups. Cade banked the fire. They said goodnight in the way of men who are going to see each other in the morning and don't feel the need to say everything tonight. But in the morning, when Elias rode out with Duchess saddled and his saddlebags loaded and the ranch looking, not perfect, never perfect, but alive, genuinely alive in the way that a thing is when it's been fought for. Cade was standing in the yard. He'd been up before Elias. He'd fed the cattle and checked the heifer's ear and written the morning's notes in his book, and was standing in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets when Elias came out of the barn room for the last time. They looked at each other. "The offer stands," Cade said. "When you're done in Mill Haven, whatever that looks like." Elias nodded. He swung up into the saddle. Duchess was restless. She knew the direction south, and she had opinions about getting back to lower altitude and warmer air, and she wasn't shy about expressing them. "You're going to be fine," Elias said. "I know," Cade said. Then, like he wanted to be clear, "I know that now. I didn't know it in October." Elias looked at him for one more moment. This young man who'd been gaunt and hollow-eyed and holding a rope splint in a failing barn 5 months ago, and who was now standing straight in the morning air with the book in his coat pocket, and the certain look of someone who knows his ground. And then he turned Duchess south and rode. He didn't look back. Not from coldness, just from the knowledge that looking back was a habit that didn't serve. And he was trying, as he'd told Cade, to be honest with himself about which habits served and which ones didn't. The 40 miles south took him 2 days, riding steady but easy on Duchess's knee, which had held up through the winter better than he'd expected and deserved not to be pushed now. He camped the first night in the same stand of pines where he'd camped on the way up in October, which felt like a different lifetime, which in some ways it was. He lay on his back and looked at the stars through the pine branches. The sky was clear, genuinely clear, the first fully clear sky he'd seen in what felt like months. He thought about what was waiting in Millhaven, not with anxiety exactly, but with the focused attention of a man trying to see clearly. He was going back with $14 and worn-out clothes. That was the simple ledger. He looked older than he had in October, probably. He was definitely thinner. His hands were rougher. His coat had a repair on the left shoulder that he'd done himself, and that was visible if you were looking. From the outside, he'd gained nothing. He looked at the stars and thought about what Hector Bridges had said, building something that was going to outlast him. He thought about Cade in the yard this morning, standing straight. He thought about 61 head of cattle that were alive and would be alive in the spring. He thought about fence lines that were standing. He thought about 6 months of letters to Lydia Ashcroft and what had built in that space, in the careful exchange of honest sentences, the way two people can come to know each other across distance if they're willing to say real things rather than safe ones. He didn't know what Silas was going to say. He'd spent 6 months not knowing, and he'd learned to carry that uncertainty without it bending him, which was maybe the most useful thing the winter had taught him. You did the work that was in front of you. You made the choice that was right in the moment, not the choice that seemed most likely to pay off. You did it again the next day. You kept doing it when no one was watching and when the weather was bad and when you were tired and there was no obvious reward coming. And then you found out what it added up to. He closed his eyes. The pines moved in a light wind, a warmer wind than he'd felt in months, coming up from the south. The horses, Duchess and a borrowed pack mule he was returning to Harlan, moved quietly in the dark. He slept, and this time the sleep was deep and full, and he didn't wake until the birds started at first light, which was something he hadn't managed since October. The second day of riding brought him out of the mountains and into the broader valley country south of Millhaven, and then the town itself. Smoke from chimneys, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer, the dog that always barked at the sound of horses on the main road. He rode through without stopping, because he wasn't stopping in Millhaven. He'd been traveling for 2 days, and he didn't want to see anyone in town before he did what he'd come back to do. He rode east. The Ashcroft Ranch came into view in the late afternoon, the glass windows catching the low April sun the way they had in October, the whole operation looking exactly as it had when he'd ridden away, solid, organized, the product of decades of deliberate work, the same hitching rail, the same porch. He tied Duchess there. He knocked the worst of the road off his coat. He was wearing the mended shirt again, the one with the visible repair on the sleeve, because it was his best shirt and there was no point in pretending otherwise. He was standing at the foot of the porch steps when the door opened. It wasn't Silas. Lydia stood in the doorway. She had a book in her hand, a finger marking her place, and she was looking at him with the expression he'd last seen when she'd caught her horse and he'd caught the bridle. The same measuring quality, but something added to it now, something that he couldn't name but recognized the shape of. She looked at him for a moment. He looked at her. "You're thinner," she said. "Yes." She seemed to consider that. "My father's in the study." I figured. Neither of them moved for a moment. "Elias," she said, and it was the first time she'd said his name, and he registered that without moving. "Yes." "Whatever he says—" She stopped, started again. He's going to make you wait in the sitting room first. He always does. Don't let it mean anything. Before he could answer, she stepped back inside and the door was half closed and he was alone on the porch in the April afternoon with that sentence in the air around him. Don't let it mean anything. He went up the steps and knocked on the door. And this time, waiting on the other side of it, was not an impossible request, but an answer. Whatever answer that was. Whatever Silas Ashcroft had decided in the careful silence of 6 months, reading letters from neighboring ranchers and watching from 40 miles away, whether a young man with $14 and a horse with a bad knee was the kind of person who did the right thing when the right thing cost something. Elias knocked on the door and waited. He'd gotten good at waiting. Thomas Ashcroft opened the door. He was 25, a year older than Cade Sutton, built like his father, but with a quicker face, the kind of face that processed information fast and usually had an opinion ready before the information had finished arriving. He looked at Elias on the porch with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was not quite welcoming either. The expression of a man who has heard enough about you to be curious and isn't sure yet whether curiosity is going to turn into something else. Boone, he said. Thomas. A beat. Thomas stepped back and held the door. Come in. He's expecting you. The inside of the Ashcroft house was what the outside suggested. Solid, functional, the kind of home that had been built for living in rather than impressing. A good wool rug, solid furniture, a fireplace with a real fire in it, and the warmth of it hit Elias in a way that 2 days of riding in April cold had made him unprepared for. He stood in the entry hall and resisted the urge to simply stand there with his eyes closed. Sitting rooms through there, Thomas said, nodding toward a door on the left. I'll tell him you're here. Elias went into the sitting room. It was a plain room, 2 chairs, a small table, a window looking out over the south pasture, a bookshelf along one wall that had been used rather than arranged, the books in the imperfect order of a family that actually read them. He didn't sit. He stood by the window and looked out at the pasture, which was muddy with snowmelt and beginning to show the first thin green of new grass at the edges. He thought about what Lydia had said on the porch. Don't let it mean anything. He thought about the sitting room in that context. The deliberate pause, the managed wait, the studied signal that whoever was in the sitting room was not yet inside the conversation. He decided she was right. He decided not to let it mean anything. He waited 11 minutes. He knew because he counted, the same way he'd counted on this porch in October, which felt now like something that had happened to a younger and significantly more nervous version of himself. He was still nervous. He was just better at holding it still. The door opened and Silas Ashcroft came in. He looked exactly the same. The white beard, the solid frame, the gray eyes that moved over everything with that surveyor's precision. He was not carrying his coffee this time. He came in and stood in the center of the room and looked at Elias the way he'd looked at him in October. And whatever measuring he was doing, he did it in about 4 seconds. You look like you had a hard winter, Silas said. I did, Elias said. Sit down. They both sat. Silas laced his hands together and looked at Elias with the particular stillness of a man who is in no hurry because he has already made up his mind and knows that rushing the next 5 minutes would waste what the previous 6 months built. Bridges wrote me 3 times, Silas said. Dawson wrote me once. I heard from 2 other men I won't name who had occasion to come through the Clearwater Fork this winter. Elias waited. The Sutton operation is in better shape than it's been since the boy's father was alive. Probably better than that, if I'm being straight about it, because the boy's father was a decent rancher, but he wasn't much of a teacher, and what he built was going to die with him. Silas paused. It's not dying with him now. That's on you. It's on Cade, Elias said. He did the work. You know what I mean? Yes, sir, but I want to be accurate about it. Silas looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not softening exactly, but a slight adjustment, like a man recalibrating a measurement. All right, Silas said. Be accurate about it. I showed him what I knew. He's the one who took it in and built it into something permanent. A man can explain things all winter, and if the other person isn't the right kind of person, it just falls out. Cade's the right kind of person. I can't take credit for that. Silas was quiet. The fire in the next room gave a soft sound, a log settling. What would you take credit for? Silas asked. It was a real question asked with an intent Elias couldn't entirely read. He thought about it honestly, rather than reaching for the modest answer or the impressive one. I stayed, he said finally. There were a few points this winter where the sensible move would have been to call the thing a loss and come down out of the mountains. I didn't. I don't know if that counts as something to take credit for, or just something I did. It counts, Silas said. He said it the way he said most things, without decoration, which made it land harder than a longer statement would have. He stood up, which Elias hadn't expected, and went to the window and stood there with his back to the room for a moment, looking at the same muddy south pasture that Elias had been looking at before he came in. I'm going to tell you something, Silas said to the window, that I've told exactly 2 people in my life, my wife, and now you. Elias sat very still. 1859, Silas said. I was 20 years old. I was working a ranch up in the Dakota Territory for a man named Gareth Cole. Fair man, hard man, built something real from nothing the way men had to back then. He had a daughter named Margaret. He paused. The name cost him something, just slightly, in the set of his shoulders. I went to Gareth and told him I wanted to court her. He looked at me. I had about $30 to my name, a good horse, and not much else. And he didn't say no. Elias heard the echo of his own October, 6 months ago, with a clarity that was almost physical. He sent me north, Silas continued. A neighbor's son had a small operation that was failing. Gareth wanted someone to go up and see if it could be saved. No pay, no timeline, no promises. He turned from the window and looked at Elias directly. Sound familiar? Yes, sir, Elias said quietly. I was up there 8 months. Longer than I told you, longer than he asked. Because when I got up there, the situation was worse than he'd let on, and leaving before it was fixed felt wrong. He came back and sat down. When I came back, Gareth looked at me the same way I looked at you this morning, and he told me something I've been carrying for 23 years. He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment, which was the first time Elias had seen Silas Ashcroft look at anything without that outward measuring quality. It was a different kind of looking, inward, the look of someone handling something they keep in a careful place. He said that the reason he sent young men north, Silas said, was not to see if they could do the work. Any reasonably capable man can do work if the reward is big enough. He sent them north to see what they did when the reward wasn't certain, when nobody was watching, when the easy choice and the right choice weren't the same thing. He paused. He said that was the only test that told him anything real about a man. The room was quiet. Outside, the April wind moved through the cottonwoods along the fence line, a sound that was different from the mountain wind, softer, less committed. Did you pass? Elias asked. He wasn't sure why he asked it. It came out before he decided to say it. Silas looked at him. I married Margaret in the fall of 1860. He said it simply. She died in 1878. Fever. Another pause. Lydia has her mother's way of taking up space in a room. I suspect you've noticed that. Elias didn't answer that directly. I've noticed, he said. Silas nodded. He leaned back slightly. The first truly relaxed posture Elias had ever seen from him. Here's where we are, Silas said, and his voice shifted, became the voice of a man moving from the personal to the practical, which was where Silas Ashcroft was clearly more comfortable. You passed the test. I want to be clear about that first, so you're not sitting there wondering. Something went through Elias that he didn't show. It wasn't exactly relief. It was more like the feeling of a held breath released, something that had been under tension for 6 months slowly coming off the load. Thank you, he said. His voice came out level, which he was grateful for. Don't thank me yet, Silas said, because I'm not going to hand you anything. That's not what this is. I didn't expect you to. Good. Silas looked at him steadily. I have 12,000 acres and over 1,000 head. I've been running this operation for 20 years with good hands and my own judgment. And for the last 3 years, I've been watching Thomas develop and deciding how to bring him in as a real partner, not just my son. That's a process that takes time and trust, and I'm not shortcutting it. He paused. But my operation has a north section, about 800 acres up along the creek bend, good grazing land, been running it as an extension of the main herd, but it needs its own management, its own attention. I've been putting that off because I didn't have the right person. Elias listened. I'm offering you a partnership on that section, Silas said. Not a job, not wages, a genuine partnership. You run it, you make the decisions, you take a share of what it produces. It'll take 2-3 years to know if it's going to be what it should be. There'll be hard seasons. I'll give you opinion when you ask for it, and stay out of it when you don't. He paused. I'll provide the starting cattle. You provide the work and the judgment. We'll set the split fair and write it down proper with a lawyer present, so there's no argument later about who said what. Elias sat with it for a moment. And Lydia? He asked. Directly. Because directness was the only language this conversation had ever spoken. That's between you and her, Silas said. I'm not trading my daughter for a business arrangement. The partnership is because I think you're the right man for that piece of land. Lydia... He stopped, and for the first time there was something in his face that was plainly a father's feeling, undisguised. Lydia makes her own decisions. She always has. Her mother was the same way. I learned to stop fighting that instinct about 30 years ago. He said it with the particular resignation of a man who has made peace with something and is not entirely sure how he feels about that peace. I'm going to be honest with you about something, Silas added. I didn't know, when I sent you north, if you were the right man. I had a feeling, which is not the same thing. A feeling is just a starting point. He looked at Elias with those gray eyes. The letters from Bridges and the others told me some things. But what told me more was what they didn't write. They didn't write about you making sure they knew what you were doing. They didn't write about you talking about what you expected to get from this arrangement. They just wrote about what they saw. A man doing work that needed doing without performing it for an audience. He paused. That was what I was looking for. Gareth Cole looked for the same thing in me. I've been looking for it in every man who's come asking about my daughter, and most of them gave me the performance instead. Elias thought about those 40 miles of mountains, about fixing fence at midnight in a blizzard with nobody watching except the cattle and Cade, who didn't count as an audience because Cade was too busy working to watch, about writing the pipe fitting for the 5th time because the pipe needed fixing, not because Bridges might ride by. I wasn't thinking about the letters, he said. I know, Silas said. That's the point. They looked at each other across the plane room, these two men separated by 23 years in the shape of the same test, and something passed between them that was not exactly understanding and not exactly respect, and was probably some third thing that doesn't have a clean name. I'll take the partnership, Elias said. Silas nodded once. We'll sit down with Thomas this week and work out the terms. All right. Silas stood. Elias stood. They shook hands. A different handshake from October's, which had been the handshake of a man completing a transaction. This one had weight to it, the weight of something that had been tested and held. One more thing, Silas said, not releasing the handshake immediately. Sir, whatever happens with Lydia, and I meant what I said, that's between the two of you. You understand that working alongside this family means working alongside all of it. The good seasons and the bad. Thomas when he's being difficult, which is more often than I'd like. My own judgment when it's wrong, which happens. He paused. Are you clear on that? I'm clear on it, Elias said. Silas released his hand. She's in the kitchen, he said, the same way he might say the horses needed water, plainly, without ceremony, and walked out of the sitting room and left Elias standing in it alone. Elias stood there for a moment. Then he went to find the kitchen. It was at the back of the house, a big room with a south-facing window and a long table and the smell of coffee and something baking. Lydia was standing at the counter with her back to the door, and she didn't turn around when he came in, which meant she'd heard the sitting room door and knew who was walking down the hall. He said yes, she said, still not turning. He offered a partnership on the north section. That's not what I asked. A pause. Elias came further into the kitchen and stopped about 6 feet away from her at the end of the table. He said what happens next is between you and me, Elias said. She turned then. She was holding a dish towel and she set it down on the counter and looked at him with that expression. The measuring one, the same one from the bridal moment 18 months ago, the same one from the porch an hour ago, but different again now, with something added that he was starting to think was what happened when measuring was finished and had produced an answer. You look terrible, she said again. You said that already. It's still true. She looked at him carefully. Are you all right? The question surprised him. Not the question itself, but the way it was asked. With the directness of someone who wanted a real answer, not a social one. I'm tired, he said honestly. I've been tired since about December. I expect I'll be tired for a while longer. But you're all right. Yes. She nodded. She pulled out a chair at the table, the chair at the far end, and sat down with her hands in her lap and looked at him. Sit down, Elias, she said. You've been writing for 2 days. He sat down. Not at the far end, at the near end, with the length of the table between them, which seemed right for this. Enough space to be honest, not so much that the honesty had to travel too far. I got your last letter, she said. The one about writing South April 1st. I know, I sent it. The corner of her mouth moved. You said if it felt like a bad omen, I could tell you when I saw you. I did say that. It doesn't feel like a bad omen. He looked at her across the table. He'd spent 6 months writing letters to this woman, saying real things in lamplight in a barn room 40 miles away, and the letters had built something that he'd been aware of and careful with and not entirely sure how to hold. Now she was 6 feet away, and the lamplight was replaced by an April afternoon through a south window, and the distance was suddenly, concretely, a solvable problem. I'd like to call on you, he said, properly, with your father's permission, which he's given, if you're willing. She looked at him for a moment. You came up here in October with $14 and a plan made of air, she said. You went up a mountain for 6 months in winter with no guarantee of anything at all. She paused. I think we can probably dispense with some of the formality. That's not a yes, he said. No, she agreed, but it's close. She stood up and went to the stove and came back with 2 cups of coffee, setting one in front of him without asking whether he wanted it, which he found he didn't mind. He picked it up, and it was the best coffee he'd had since October, and for a moment he just sat with that fact. Tell me about the ranch, she said, sitting back down. The real version, not the one my father heard from Bridges. So he told her. He told her about the barn room with the drafty window and the corn husk mattress. He told her about Cade and the rope splint and the first morning when he'd looked at the list of things wrong with the place and had to decide whether to feel overwhelmed or just start somewhere and start somewhere. He told her about the February storm and the fence at midnight and Cade's hands wrapped in cloth strips in the lamplight. He told her about the calf with the bad leg that they'd thought was a lost cause, who was now running around the North Draw causing trouble for everyone. He told her, and she listened the way she wrote, with complete attention, without filling the silences, her eyes on his face the whole time. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. What did it feel like, she asked, when you were deciding whether to fix things for Cade, not just do your own work and leave? He thought about it. It didn't feel like a decision, he said. The situation needed something. He needed something, and I was there. That's not as simple as you're making it sound. Maybe not, he admitted, but it didn't feel complicated at the time. She looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back, and the April afternoon moved through the window, and the coffee went from hot to warm, and neither of them seemed to be in a hurry about anything. My father is going to be difficult, she said finally. I know. Not about this. I mean, in general. As a partner. He has very specific opinions about how land should be managed, and he expresses them whether you've asked or not. I've noticed. Thomas is easier mostly, but he has a competitive streak that takes some managing. She paused. I'm telling you this because you should know what you're signing up for. It's not just a partnership on 800 acres. It's this whole... She gestured vaguely, encompassing the house, the family, the 12,000 acres outside the window. All of it. I know, he said. And you still want to. I still want to, he said. The north section and all of it. The corner of her mouth moved again, more than before. Good, she said, because the north section has a drainage problem on the east side that's been bothering me for 2 years, and my father keeps saying it's not serious, and I think he's wrong. Elias blinked. Then for the first time since October, he laughed. A real one. Surprised out of him, the kind that comes from somewhere lower than the chest. Lydia looked pleased with herself in a way she didn't try to hide. I'll look at the drainage, he said, when he'd recovered. I know you will, she said. Outside, the afternoon was going golden, the low April sun making the muddy south pasture look better than it was, the cottonwoods moving in a light wind. Inside the kitchen of the Ashcroft house, 2 people sat across a long table with their coffee going cold and more to say than the afternoon had room for, and neither of them was in a hurry to leave. Elias Boone had ridden back to Millhaven with $14 in worn-out clothes and a horse with a bad knee. He sat now in the warmth of this kitchen and understood something that would have been harder to see in October, that the $14 had never been the problem. The question was never what you had. It was what you did when what you had wasn't enough, and you did the thing anyway. He'd done the thing anyway. He picked up his coffee cup and found it still had some warmth left in it. That, for now, was enough. The drainage problem on the east side of the north section was exactly as serious as Lydia had said it was. Elias found that out in his first week working the land, when he walked the full perimeter of the 800 acres and spent 2 hours on the east boundary watching the way the snowmelt moved across the lower pasture, pooling wrong, sitting too long, leaving the soil sour in a strip about 40 feet wide that ran nearly the full length of the fence line. He squatted down and pressed his hand into the ground and felt what was underneath. Hard clay pan about 18 inches down, impermeable, redirecting water laterally instead of letting it drain through. The grass above it was thin and yellow at the edges. Cattle would work that strip last and reluctantly, which meant they'd be pushing the better grazing harder than it needed to go. He came back to the main house that evening and told Silas. Silas looked at him with an expression that was not quite defensive and not quite impressed, and was probably both at once. "I know about the clay pan," he said. "Then you know it needs ditching." "I know it's a significant undertaking." "It is," Elias agreed. "About 3 weeks of work, I'd estimate. Early summer, before the ground gets too hard. But if we do it right, that strip comes back in 2 seasons, and you've got 40 additional feet of good grazing the full length of the east boundary." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Lydia told you about it." "She mentioned it." Something passed through Silas's face that Elias was learning to read. A particular quality of restraint. A man who has an opinion he's decided to keep to himself for the moment. "She's been telling me about that drainage for 2 years, Silas said. "I know." Another pause. "You're going to fix it." "That's my plan." Silas looked at him. Then he picked up his coffee and went back to whatever he'd been reading before Elias came in, which was the closest thing to approval that Silas Ashcroft offered on a Tuesday evening in April, and Elias had already learned to receive it as such. He spent the first month learning the north section the way he'd learned the Clearwater Fork, methodically, without rushing to conclusions, letting the land tell him what it was before deciding what to do with it. He walked it in different lights, in rain and in sun, in the early morning when the dew showed him where the water moved, and in the late afternoon when the shadows showed him the shape of the ground. He moved the cattle through it in a rotation that was different from how Silas had been running it, not dramatically different, but adjusted, responsive to what the particular pastures could actually support rather than what it seemed like they should support. Thomas noticed on the second week and came up to the north section fence line with his arms crossed and the look of a man who has questions about what he's seen. "You're running them light on the upper bench," Thomas said. "The upper bench is thinner than it looks. 2 hard weeks of grazing, and it won't come back until July. My father's run cattle on that bench for 15 years. "I know." Elias kept working the fence check he'd been doing. "He's been lucky with the timing, mostly, or the herd's been small enough that it didn't matter. It's going to matter at the scale you're talking about running next year." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He had his father's directness without yet having his father's patience, which made him easier to argue with and harder to convince. "You've been here 6 weeks, Thomas said. "I have." "My father's been here 20 years. "I know that too." Elias stopped and looked at Thomas directly. "I'm not saying your father managed this wrong. I'm saying the north section has a particular set of conditions that need their own approach. That's all I'm saying." Thomas looked at him for a long moment with the competitive streak that Lydia had warned him about, visible and calculating. Then he looked at the upper bench and at the cattle and back at Elias. "Show me," he said finally. So Elias showed him. They spent 2 hours on the upper bench, Elias pointing out what he'd found. The soil depth, the grass species, the way the previous year's overgrazing showed in the root structure if you pulled up a handful and looked at it. Thomas asked good questions, the kind that came from someone who genuinely knew the land and was updating his model of it rather than defending the old one. By the end of it, Thomas's arms were uncrossed. "All right," he said, which from Thomas meant roughly the same thing that thank you meant from anyone else. "It's not a criticism of how it's been run," Elias said again. "I heard you the first time," Thomas said. but he said it without heat. They walked back down to the fence line together, and that was the beginning of something with Thomas that was not exactly friendship, and not exactly the absence of it either. More like the cautious mutual respect of two capable men who've decided to stop testing each other and start working, courting Lydia in the proper sense, which is to say, in the presence of her family and the awareness of the community and all the visible social architecture of 1882 Montana turned out to be both simpler and more complicated than the 6 months of letters had prepared him for. Simpler because they already knew each other in some essential way, the way you know a person when you've written honestly to them in lamplight for half a year. More complicated because knowing a person in letters and knowing them in the physical dailiness of actual life were related but not identical, and the distance between them had to be crossed with some care. She was not easy, Lydia. He'd known that, but knowing it abstractly and experiencing it concretely were different things. She had opinions that she expressed without waiting to be asked, which he didn't mind, but she also had a way of being right that she didn't always wear lightly. She pushed back on things, on his ideas about the north section rotation, on the timing he'd chosen for the ditching project, on a decision he'd made in July about selling 3 head that she thought he should have kept. Sometimes she was right, sometimes he was. They worked out a language for that disagreement that was blunt enough to be useful and contained enough not to become something else, and the working out of it was not always comfortable. He told her once, after a particularly direct disagreement about the east ditch timing, she wanted it done sooner. He thought the ground wasn't ready, that he wasn't used to being argued with this much. "I know," she said without apology. "I didn't say it was a problem." She looked at him. "I know that too." The ditch got done in early June, when Elias determined the ground was ready, and it came out better than either of them had projected, which he thought was probably the best available outcome. Not her being right, not him being right, but both of them having pushed and the result being better for it. Silas said nothing about the ditch when it was finished, but he rode the east fence line the week after, and Elias saw him stop at the completed section and look at it for a while. And that evening at supper he mentioned to the table generally that the east section was looking improved. He did not specify what improvement or who had made it. That was as close as Silas Ashcroft got to admitting he'd been wrong about the drainage for 2 years, and Elias accepted it in the spirit offered, which was to say, without comment. They married in October, 1 year after Elias had ridden up to this porch with $14 and a plan made of air. The wedding was small. The Ashcroft family, Harlan Brigg from the Broken Spur, a handful of neighbors including Hector Bridges, who came with his son and shook Elias's hand with the same gravity he'd used on the fence line in March, like the handshake was completing something. Cade Sutton rode down from the Clearwater Fork for it, arriving the evening before with his horse in good condition and his coat cleaner than Elias had ever seen it, and a bottle of something he set on the kitchen table without explanation. "Ranch is good," Cade said when Elias asked. "Lost 1 heifer in September. Birthing complication. Couldn't have seen it coming. Otherwise good. You managing the fall rotation all right?" "Been doing it since June," Cade said, with a quiet pride that was completely unlike self-congratulation and entirely justified. They sat up late that night, the two of them, in the Ashcroft kitchen with Cade's bottle and 2 glasses, and talked the way they'd talked in the barn room all those months ago. Directly, without performing anything for anyone, about what had happened and what was next and what they'd learned from the parts in between. "You ever think about what would have happened," Cade said at some point, "if you turned around when you got to my place in October? If you'd looked at it and just gone back?" "Once or twice," Elias admitted. "What stopped you?" Elias thought about it honestly. "I didn't know what I was going to do yet. I just knew leaving wasn't it." Cade turned his glass in his hands. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. "I'm aware that's obvious, but I wanted to say it straight." "I know," Elias said. "I'm glad I stayed too." They didn't say much after that. They didn't need to. The wedding itself was on a Thursday, which Lydia had chosen because, she said, nobody expected anything significant to happen on a Thursday, and that was exactly when significant things should happen. The ceremony was short. Lydia was not sentimental about ceremony, only about the things ceremony was supposed to mark. And when it was over, Silas shook Elias's hand with the weight that handshake always carried, and Margaret Ashcroft, who was Lydia's aunt and the closest thing to a mother figure at the event, embraced Lydia with a fierceness that made Lydia's eyes go bright in a way she covered quickly. Thomas clapped Elias on the shoulder, hard, the way Thomas did everything. "Try not to be right about everything," he said. "I'll do my best," Elias said. "That's what I'm afraid of," Thomas said, and for the first time since April, there was something in his voice that was unambiguously warm. They settled into the north section house that Silas had built for them. Simple, solid, a timber and stone structure in the same style as the main house, with a south window in the kitchen that Lydia had specified, and a good fireplace and enough room to grow into. It wasn't finished in the way a house is never quite finished when the people in it are still figuring out what they need. But it was theirs, and the particulars of what made it theirs accumulated the way all real things accumulate, slowly, imperfectly, through use. The first year of the partnership was hard in the ways Silas had promised it would be hard, and in a few ways he hadn't mentioned. The North Section's first full grazing season proved out Elias's rotation theory on the upper bench, which meant he had to have a conversation with Thomas about it, that he handled as carefully as he could, and Thomas received as gracefully as Thomas was capable of, which was to say, with only one day of visible difficulty before he came around. The East Ditch performed through the wet spring even better than projected, which meant the strip of sour ground was already showing new grass by June of the following year. Thin, tentative, but there. Lydia walked the east fence with him in early July and looked at the new growth without saying anything, and Elias didn't say anything either, and neither of them needed to. There were bad weeks. A problem with the water rights on the North Creek boundary that required 3 months of conversation with a neighboring rancher and cost more in time and aggravation than in anything else. But time and aggravation were real costs. A calf loss rate in the first spring that was higher than it should have been because Elias made a decision about shelter timing that turned out to be wrong, and he sat with that the same way he'd sat with every mistake, clear-eyed, without excessive self-punishment, focused on what he was going to do differently. Lydia asked him once, during that spring, whether the losses were bothering him more than he was showing. "Some," he said honestly. "What are you doing with it?" "Figuring out what I missed, so I don't miss it again." She looked at him. "And when you've figured that out, then I'll put it away." She nodded. "All right." She paused. "For what it's worth, you couldn't have known about the late cold snap. Nobody predicted it. I could have planned for it anyway." "Yes," she said, "you could have. Now you will." She said it without softening it into a comfort, which he valued more than the softened version would have been. Silas's opinions continued to arrive whether asked for or not, which was exactly what he'd promised. Some of them were good opinions. Silas knew his land and his animals and his market in ways that came from decades of accumulated observation, and ignoring that would have been stupid. Some of them were the opinions of a man who'd been doing things a particular way for 20 years and had stopped questioning whether that way was still the best way. Elias learned to distinguish between them without making the distinction visible, which required more diplomacy than he'd known he had. The relationship between him and Silas changed across that first year in ways that were too slow and incremental to notice in the day-to-day, but were visible when you looked back. Silas began deferring to Elias's judgment on North Section decisions without being asked, which was significant because Silas deferred to almost nobody's judgment about anything. He began bringing questions to Elias, not often, and always framed as discussions rather than requests for help, but the framing didn't obscure what they were. In November of the first year, when there was a difficult decision about whether to sell part of the main herd before winter or carry them through, Silas sat down with Elias and Thomas together and laid out the numbers and asked what they thought. And when Elias and Thomas's analysis pointed in opposite directions, Silas listened to both of them with genuine attention and made a decision that split the difference in a way that proved correct by spring. Afterward, Thomas said to Elias, "He's never asked me what I thought about a herd decision before." "He trusts you," Elias said. "He's always trusted me." "Not the same way," Elias said. And Thomas thought about that and didn't argue. Their first child was born in the second autumn, a boy they named James, which was Lydia's grandfather's name, and also, though Elias didn't say this out loud, the name of his mother's father, a man he'd never met but who appeared in the few stories his mother had told about her own family before things went wrong. James arrived in late September, inconveniently during calving preparation. which was the kind of timing that a person could take as the world demonstrating its indifference to human plans, or could simply accept as the condition of being alive in a working landscape where everything happened at once. He was a difficult baby. Elias had not understood, before James, what difficult actually meant in that context. Not difficult like a hard conversation or a bad storm, but difficult like a small, unreasonable person who needed things at all hours and communicated all needs through a single channel of varying volume. Lydia handled it with the particular competence of someone who doesn't waste energy pretending things are easier than they are. There were nights she was worn through completely, sitting up in the rocking chair with the baby at 3 a.m, and Elias got up too, not because she asked, but because there was no sensible universe in which she should be the only one awake. "You have to be up at 5, she said one of those nights. "So do you." "I don't have to check the cattle." "The cattle can wait 20 minutes, he said. "Give him to me." She handed James over with the slight resistance of someone who is too tired to maintain pride about needing help, and Elias walked the length of the kitchen with the baby until James made the transition from screaming to complaining to the snuffling quiet of a person who has decided to stop fighting and accept sleep. He stood in the kitchen in the dark with his son's weight against his chest and listened to Lydia's breathing from the rocking chair go even, and didn't move for a long time because moving might undo both of them. That was the thing nobody had told him about this life, about what it was to build something with another person day after day in the ordinary grinding dailiness of it. That the moments that mattered were mostly not the dramatic ones, not the blizzard, not the fence at midnight, not the handshake in Silas's sitting room. Those were the moments you could tell as a story. The ones that actually built the thing were quieter and smaller and would never make it into any telling. The 3 a.m. in the kitchen, the argument about the drainage that made the drainage better, the moment Thomas uncrossed his arms on the upper bench, the evening Silas asked what they both thought. Those were the load-bearing moments, the ones underneath everything else. By the 3rd year, the north section was producing what it should produce. The east strip had fully recovered. Good grass, the cattle working it willingly, the pasture rotation holding up under a drier summer than anyone had planned for. Elias had expanded the operation by 200 acres on the western edge, a negotiated purchase from a neighboring rancher who was retiring, which he'd brought to Silas as a proposal rather than a decision, and Silas had looked it over and said it was sensible without making it a larger moment than it was, which meant they were both operating from the same understanding of how this partnership worked. Thomas's competitive streak had not disappeared, but it had found a more useful direction. He'd begun pushing the main operation harder, responding to what he saw developing on the north section with something that was less rivalry than it was ambition, and the whole Ashcroft enterprise ran better for the friction between them. They'd reached a point of genuine collaboration that would have been unrecognizable to either of them in April of that first year, a point where they could disagree directly without it becoming something else, and could agree without it requiring performance. Silas watched this from a slight remove, with the expression of a man seeing something he'd planned for arriving on schedule, and if there was satisfaction in it, and there clearly was, he expressed it the way Silas expressed most things, which was indirectly and briefly. One evening in the 3rd autumn, the whole family gathered at the main house for supper. It was a habit that had developed without being planned. Sunday evenings, the table pulled long, the food simple but adequate, the conversation ranging from practical to personal in the particular unstructured way of people who know each other well enough to not need an agenda. James was walking by then, a new and alarmingly mobile development that required at least one adult to maintain awareness of his location at all times. He had Lydia's quality of taking up exactly the right amount of space, which in a toddler expressed itself as a remarkably specific confidence about which direction he wanted to go, and a total disregard for whether that direction was sensible. He made his way to Silas, which he often did, drawn to the old rancher by whatever logic governed the preferences of people not yet 2 years old. Silas picked him up with the careful deliberateness of a large man handling something small, and set him on his knee and regarded him with the same measuring eyes. He turned on everything, but softer, genuinely softer, in a way that Silas's face didn't manage in most other contexts. Lydia watched this from across the table and caught Elias's eye, and he saw in her face something complex and quiet. Love for her father in it, and something about her mother who wasn't here, and something about James, and something about all of it together being more than the sum of its parts. Elias looked back at her and didn't try to say anything about it, because some things say themselves better in the looking than in any words available. After supper, when James was finally asleep and Thomas had gone back to the bunkhouse, and the evening was winding toward its end, Silas and Elias sat on the porch the way they'd taken to sitting on occasional evenings, not talking much, just occupying the same space in the dark, looking out at the land that connected them. "Third year," Silas said eventually. "Third year," Elias agreed. A pause. An owl somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek. "North section's going to have a good year," Silas said. "Better than I expected when we set the terms." "Better than I expected too, to be honest." Silas looked out at the dark. The east strip especially. He said it plainly, without ceremony. "That was Lydia's call originally," Elias said. "I know it was," Silas said. And then, after a beat, "She gets that from her mother." They sat with that for a moment. "Silas," Elias said. "What? Why didn't you just fix the drainage yourself? You knew about the clay pan." A pause. Silas turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I knew about it," he said. "I had a plan for it, more or less. But there was always something more pressing, and eventually I stopped seeing it as pressing at all." He paused. "That happens. You look at the same problem long enough, and it starts to look like a condition rather than a problem. It stops asking to be fixed." Elias thought about the barn room at the Clearwater Fork in October. The list of things wrong with the Sutton place. How some of it had been like that. Things that had been wrong long enough that they'd become part of the landscape. "You need someone new to see it," Elias said. "Yes," Silas said. "That's the value of bringing someone in." He paused. "That's one of the values." He didn't say the other values. He didn't need to. They were sitting on the porch together on a third-year October evening, with Lydia inside and James asleep, and Thomas down at the bunkhouse, and the whole working machinery of a serious operation running in the dark around them. And the other values were present in all of it, evident without being named. Elias thought about that morning 3 years ago when he'd ridden north out of Mill Haven with $14 in his wallet and a horse with a bad knee and a plan made of mostly air. He thought about what he'd been trying to prove, or thought he was trying to prove, and how the proving of it had turned out to be the wrong frame entirely. You didn't prove yourself to other people. You proved yourself to the situation, to the fence that needed fixing, to the young rancher who needed teaching, to the animal that needed finding in the dark. The other people were just the ones who happened to be watching, or not watching. That was the point. He thought about his father, still somewhere in Kansas, still making the easier choice when the easier choice was wrong, still finding reasons why the conditions weren't right for the effort. He thought about him without bitterness, which had taken time to get to. Not absence of feeling, but feeling that had found its right size and stopped taking up more room than it deserved. His father had made him, in the specific way that bad examples make their children, into someone who couldn't stop moving toward the harder right thing. That was a crooked kind of gift, but it was a gift. He thought about Cade Sutton up in the Clearwater Fork, who had written twice since the wedding, practical letters about the ranch, with a quality of confidence in them that hadn't been there in October of the first year. He thought about the fence at midnight, the two of them working in the dark without speaking because there was nothing useful to say, and they both knew it. He thought about $14. The owl in the cottonwoods called again. Silas finished his coffee. "Better get in," Silas said, standing with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints knew they were over 60. "Early morning." "Always is," Elias said. Silas went inside. Elias sat on the porch for another few minutes, in the dark and the cold and the quiet of the Montana night, listening to the land settle into itself. The north section fence line was out there in the dark, standing. The east strip was there, its new grass resting under the autumn. His son was sleeping inside. His wife was inside. The work that had built all of it was behind him, and the work that would keep it was in front of him, and neither end of that was visible from where he sat, which was how it was supposed to be. He wasn't the same person who'd made this decision 3 years ago. He was harder in some places and less defended in others, which was probably what growing into a life looked like when you were honest about it. He'd been wrong about things and right about others, and the difference between those was less a matter of intelligence than of paying attention to the land, to the people, to the gap between what things looked like and what they were. He'd learned that the most important choices were the ones nobody was watching. That a man's character wasn't what he did when the reward was clear and the audience was present, but what he did at midnight in a blizzard with numb hands and no guarantee of anything at all. He'd learned that you couldn't build anything real on the foundation of what other people would think of it. You built it on what it actually was. He'd learned that from Silas's test, but more honestly, he'd learned it from the doing of the thing, from the months on the mountain where there was no audience and no score and just the work and the choice and the next morning. He got up from the porch chair and went inside. The kitchen was warm. Lydia was at the table with a book and a lamp, and she looked up when he came in with the expression she had in the evenings, the one that was private and unperformed, and his. "Cold out?" she said. Getting there, she turned back to her book. He poured the last of the coffee and sat down across from her, and they stayed like that for a while. In the warm kitchen, with James asleep down the hall, and the land dark and working outside, and the lamp between them burning steady. Not perfect. Never perfect. But solid, in the way things are solid when they've been tested and held. Not because nothing went wrong, but because when things went wrong, the people involved kept choosing to stay and fix them. That was enough. That had always been enough. That was finally and completely everything.